Hello, everybody. Welcome to another session of the ABC of Contemporary Capital with David Harvey. Thank you for joining us. Just want to remind all students that next week there will be no class in accordance with the CUNY vacation schedule, and that if you're watching on YouTube and you have any questions, please put it in the chat. And I will pass it to Professor David Harvey.
Okay, so I guess we can start. I wanted to just remind you again that there's no class next week. Our next meeting is in 2 weeks, but then we'll have the pleasure of doing it in person because we will be doing it live in person at People's Forum. So I hope you're up for that. I think I'm looking forward to seeing everybody in person, and maybe, it gives a different atmosphere to how everything is going. And so in 2 weeks' time, then we will meet in the People's Forum, and then we'll have one class after that, and then that'll be the end of the semester. So 2 more classes after this one. And those 2 classes will be in person at the People's Forum. Okay. So this week we're going to do some discussion on the return of the Ranter. There were various people who posed some questions in the sort of sidebar to the text, but then there are some other questions I'm sure you might have. The idea of the return of the Ranter is not I think too widespread, but I've worked a bit with a guy called Michael Hudson, who's been very helpful, I think, in defining some ideas about this. And I think that it's been interesting to sort of put that thesis up against the sorts of things that Marx was talking about, and his concerns. And his concerns were, as I sort of mentioned, that he has to deal with certain very powerful and significant categories in political economy, such as that of rent, that of merchants' capital, that of finance capital, and the state, and so on. And the issue is, why would capital tolerate having such parasites around? Some people would say, all value is created in production, so the industrial capitalist is the only one who really matters. And in Marx's time, it was not unreasonable to suggest, particularly if you were thinking about Manchester industrialism, that industrial capital was where it was at, and that the merchants were sort of helping to service the needs of industrial capital. The same would be true of the financiers and also to some degree the state apparatus, and that industrial capitalism would be dominant. And then you have to sort of say, well, what is it that merchants do, or that landed capital does, or that finance capital does, which is legitimate from the standpoint of the circulation and reproduction of industrial capital. And that then leads into the discussion of the theory of distribution and what is legitimate and what is scamming the system, if you want to call it that, and in what ways is it possible for landed capital to kind of steal stuff, like I mentioned in the paper of the Chrysler building case, and in what ways is it absolutely vital that a rate of return be calculated on money capital purely, and that rate of return being interest? What's the relationship between interest and the surplus value? And if there is a distinction within surplus value between interest and the profit which the industrialist makes, then what's the consequence of dividing the surplus value in that way into both into profit of enterprise and interest on money capital, because you could have a situation in which the pure situation would be one where a capitalist enterprise will be set up by somebody who borrowed all of the money. And having borrowed all of the money, that person goes into industrial action and starts to generate a surplus, but in the process of doing has to pay interest on the money that they've borrowed. And if the money was, if they're going to pay off the principal over time, over 10 or 15 years, they not only have to pay off the interest, but pay off the principal. And in that case, the industrialist is doing the whole activity operating on borrowed money, and that's perfectly feasible. Now, if the industrialist doesn't do that, it means that the industrialist captures what would have been interest otherwise. So in a sense, the industrialist creates enough surplus value to cover both production and the interest. But pockets both the profit of enterprise, if you want to call it that, and the interest, and so they get the whole of the thing. So you get those two extremes. In practice, most capitalist firms are probably in between. They are operating to some degree on borrowed money. In other cases, you'll find that some people say it's a better idea to work on borrowed money because interest then appears when you pay taxes as an expense, and therefore your tax bill is much less if you do it that way around. So there are various kinds of to's and fro's that are made about that. But this is the kind of question, and several people, I think, were raising the question of exactly how do we differentiate between real production, what Marx calls genuine production, and the sort of fictitious capital and the fictitious aspects, and the stuff that's all about finding money for merchants' capital, or finding money for the landlord, or finding money for the financier. So this is the issue here. And when we start to talk about the return of the rentier, I think that I would want to say, and one very simple piece of data that I didn't put in there, didn't have it when I was doing it, but the rate of increase of money and the rate of increase of credit money has been double the rate of increase of production of goods and services, which says that there's some inequality going on here, that the money side of things is going way ahead of what would be expected given the production of actual goods and services. So if you look at the rate of expansion of GDP, since 1980, you find it's about half the rate of expansion of the money supply and half the rate of expansion of indebtedness and the like. So something's going on here within the general structure of a capitalist economy, and that's something that is going on, underpins in some ways what I wanted to talk about, the return of the rentier. That is the return into the picture of people who are not doing anything and not making anything. They're just simply living off the rents which they can get from the land, the profit or the interest they can get from lending to industrial capital, or living off stocks and shares and the like. And again, in order to live, the rate of return can be quite small if you have enough initial mass. So if you're a billionaire and you're just sort of sitting there and you only get a 5% rate of return, that's still a hell of a lot of money. So you can live perfectly well on a very low rate of return if you have an initial large mass. So the question of the mass and the rate comes back in, and the like. I'm personally not in a position. I need a high rate these days because my mass is not that great. But that over time my mass may get bigger and my pension fund gets bigger and bigger, and so as it gets bigger, so I need less rate because of that. So these are the sorts of issues that are coming up. And if we're living in a rentier economy, that is a situation in which many people are living off just their rents or their interests or investments, and they're not actually organizing and doing anything, then what does this mean for the whole dynamic of capital? And to the degree that more and more people in the population are living as rentiers and are getting huge increases in their capital without doing anything, without making anything, and without organizing anything, what kind of economy does that mean? And does that kind of economy at some point or other, with a very unbalanced relationship between profit of enterprise on the one hand and the massive financial capital that's circulating on the other hand, to what degree does that imbalance at some point come to torment us, and in what ways might it signal some grand instability and within the capitalist mode of production? It's one of the big questions which lies behind this. After all, if everybody decided to be a rentier and nobody was actually producing anything, obviously we have an impossible economy. To the degree that people do produce something, earn some money, and then go off and become rentiers, so the dynamism goes out of the general economy, and so we get a structural problem emerging. So I'm wondering about that structural problem. I don't have the data and I don't have the wherewithal right now to sort of interrogate it, but it seems to me something terribly important to interrogate, in the sense that the instability of capital's future, if the rate of expansion of credit and the rate of expansion of money continues at double the rate of expansion of the actual production of goods and services, then these inequalities and these are at some point or other going to come home to roost in terms of real structural transformations of the economy, which are going to have to be made in order to correct that imbalance. But on that question we can discuss and we can see. Now, several of you had particular kinds of problems you wanted to raise, so let me open it up to you and let's see who would like to take a first crack at some of the ideas which are floating around here. So who would like to kick off? Can be observations, can be questions, explanations which are not complete, need to be.
Yeah, I had a question about what you meant by the marginalist economy, or
well, conventional economics, neoclassical economics, the one I talked about, which abandoned the labor theory of value, had to come up with its own theory of value. And its theory of value was the marginalist theory. So that's why it's called marginalist economics. and it used, what was interesting was it used that tactic that Ricardo did for land, of then kind of saying, well, what is the value of the last, in Ricardo's case, it was, what is the cost of producing on the most marginal land you need to employ in order for supply to meet demand? And that then is if you like, the cost of land. And that's why it's at the margin. And then what the marginalists did was say the same thing about labor. I employ one laborer, and I then apply 2 laborers, and then 3 laborers, and I keep on going like that. And then the question is, how much do I have to pay the last laborer in order for me to end up with supply and demand equated in the market? And therefore, the wage would be set by the marginal, by the marginal position of the last laborer you would employ. And the same would go for items of capital, and leave aside all that controversy about capital theory and just pretend we know what capital is. How many units of capital do you need to produce an automobile? well, you can sort of add them all up, and then you say, well, you know, I need 10 units, and I need 20, and I need 30, and by the time you go up the curve to getting to the 100th unit, then that is the value you have to pay to set up that for that unit. So the marginalist, it was called marginalism because it was a marginalist theory of value. And then the value of the commodity was really set by the marginal costs of each one of the factors of production. So if you're producing an automobile, you've got a land cost, you've got a labor cost, and you've got a capital cost. And when you add up all of those marginal, then you get the proper cost of the automobile at the end of the day. So that the marginalists had this theory of value of that sort, which, as I mentioned, it was very convenient for them because it simply said that you have to pay capital a lot because capital is scarce. You have to pay labor very little because labor is abundant. And so the inequality that really bothered the Ricardian socialists with their labor theory of value, with that question of, well, if labor produces the value, how come they receive so little of it? That question disappears entirely. And which is very convenient, you know. I mean, in other words, the moral argument that led John Stuart Mill, for example, to really advocate redistributive socialism. The moral argument was, well, labor is producing the value, it's not getting it through the market, therefore the state has to step in and start to redistribute value to the workers so that they get the just wage. The marginalists don't have to have that argument, because the just wage is given by the marginal value of the last unit of labor which is needed to complete a particular production process. So you then say, if anybody complains about the inequality and the unfairness and the immorality of it, the answer is, well, but this is just simply what the market does. This is the market, folks, and the market theory of value is the marginalist theory of value. Any other comments? Was it all very clear?
I'll jump in with a question. Professor, I sort of had to read through it a couple times, but which I enjoyed doing. But after reading through it a couple times, I sort of took the thing that I needed to grasp was this question of the division of surplus profit into interest and straight up profit. And then from that, you have, and then the historical argument. So it all hung together, like once I understood what it was that, you know, because it's a complex, you know, argument. There's a lot of pieces, but the thing that I was sort of most fascinated by once I, you know, was this, and you say in a couple places on page 10 that the primary social relation between capital and labor finds itself sidelined and even displaced by the complexities of debtor-credit relational roles. And then again, a couple pages later on 12, the growth and institutionalization of the moneyed class. I shouldn't read the whole, everyone has the reading in front of them, but so this turning over again of this relation that had existed between the moneyed capitalists and the industrialists, and then a couple hundred years later, it's all once again kind of turning back over. And I thought that there were like suggestions, maybe more than explicit claims in the chapter about the social effects of that, how like that could give rise to social formations that were new, just as, you know, industrial capital did. And I wonder if I was, you know, if you were being explicit and I missed the explicitness there, or if I was reading into your chapter something that wasn't necessarily there.
Well, Let's jump in on this from a couple of directions. The first would be simply this, that Marx at some point, and only in the Grundrisse does he do this, which is to say, you know, the importance of finance and capital to the production and circulation of value. It's such that it actually gives rise to a class of financiers and moneylenders and all the rest of it, and they constitute themselves as a class. And that is what he says in the Grundrisse, and I'm taking that seriously and saying, well, you know, here I am in New York City. How much industrial production is going on? And yes, there is some. It's quite a bit, actually. But there's a class of industrialists here. But then the class of financiers and money characters and Wall Street and all the rest of it, I mean, it's enormous. And then you kind of say, well, what is the interest of the producers? How do they think about the world? How do they understand the world? What are their needs? And then what are the interests of the Wall Street crowd? And I think right now we're in a situation where pretty clearly the Wall Street crowd dominates in such a way that in a sense the production people are kind of around the edges, producing things for instance, take something like I don't know, printing and design, and you know, Wall Street is always producing brochures and all kinds of things like that. And so printing and design becomes a kind of a production process, which is serving financiers. Now, in the past, in Marx's time, when he's looking at what's going on in Manchester, the financiers are serving the industrialists. The industrialists are basically saying, hey, I need some money to help me deal with the fact that the cotton crop is coming in at the wrong time of year and I need to tide over or something like that. So the banks are actually serving the industrialists. Whereas in New York, you know, if Marx was in New York right now, was writing The View from New York, you would kind of say, well, you know, that's obviously not the case. The case in New York is the other way around. And I think what we're looking at here is a transition where more and more of what is going on in the advanced capitalist countries is with the financiers essentially in the really in the center of things and able to articulate, and they start to exercise an interest as a class. So as a class, they start to lobby for deregulation of finance. They start to lobby in all kinds of ways for, new technologies of information and new technologies of investing. And so much of the stuff that goes on Wall Street now is kind of computer-led and computer calculated investments and the like. So when you kind of look at the situation we're in now and you compare it to what Marx was looking at in Manchester, you would say there's a real radical shift here. Now, it's not as if the Marx system has disappeared, because if you go to Shenzhen or somewhere like that and you go to one of those big Foxconn factories in China, you'd say, my God, this is just like Manchester. You know, and if you're in Bangladesh and you were at that Rana Plaza place where the horrible building collapses went on and so on, you say this is straight out of sort of Manchester economics, if you like. Whereas what we're having to look at is a theory of capital, which in general is no longer, if you like, completely dominated by the interests of industrial capitalists. It's more dominated, and you would say even on a global scale right now that the interests of the financiers are really running. They're really running the show a lot of the time, and so we would also want to disaggregate at a certain point and say, well, you know, if we're in Bangladesh or we're in China, maybe things look a bit different in terms of the actual production process. But what's interesting there And here's again a very important fact is if you go back to all that stuff about the equalization of the rate of profit and the transfer of value, there's value being transferred out of Bangladesh and out of Foxconn back into the high tech regions. So you've got all of that going on. But I'm sort of pushing the idea that the financiers basically have this situation in which they can dictate very much the terms of productive activity. And if you look at many of the crises that have formed over the last 10 years, they've nearly all been finance-led. And then the other side of that is even demand is now kind of led by, and consumption is led by finance. So you get this crazy situation being set up, which I think I mentioned, which is, well, you can get a developer who wants to develop a large tract of housing, and the finance of that developer will come from, say, Bank X. And then it comes to selling the properties, and Bank X will go off and offer mortgages to all the people who are buying it. You can even get closed loops like that, particularly in the production of housing. So this changes, if you like, the economic structure and circulatory processes which are going on. Now, I'm not really in a position to think through all of the ways in which this is happening. I just want to draw attention to the fact that we need to look at this very carefully in terms of, okay, how is finance capital circulating? In what ways does it actually dominate? In which ways is it still a servant? And where is it a servant and where is it not? And so this is kind of where I'm trying to go with this. I'm sorry, I'm not really answering, I think, your question. So give me. Is that helpful?
Yeah, just the slight follow-up, I guess, would be this idea that on capitalism giving rise to the proletariat who had class consciousness as like a phenomenon. Is there, it's very easy to be, I'm not very optimistic that the current transformation that you're describing is going to give rise to a revolutionary consciousness that will, but it could be the case. It was, to the extent, so do you kind of see, is that implied in what you're writing, or is that something I'm sort of reading into it because I want it to be there?
No, well, to be honest, I'm not quite sure. I really don't know. Your guess is as good as mine on this. Clearly, the what might be called a traditional sense of the working class, which is the auto worker and the steel worker and the miner and all that kind of thing, within the United States, it's largely disappeared. I mean, yeah, there's still an automobile industry there, but it's employing, very, very few laborers. And so if you look at the employment structure in the United States, back in 1970, you would say the biggest employers of labor are places like, General Motors, Ford, US Steel, all that kind of thing. You get to the 1990s, and what is it? It's McDonald's and the like. And now it's Amazon and, So obviously there's been a transition of that sort in terms of the labor process. Now, what we're seeing, interestingly, is, okay, at what point will the workers from Amazon constitute themselves as a class? And of course, what you're beginning to see are these union struggles, and the first one has been unionized and all the rest of it. So we're beginning to see the idea of, a class consciousness is beginning to emerge, but it's no longer the class consciousness in the factory. And the class consciousness that arises in a factory might look rather different than the class consciousness that arises, in an Amazon warehouse is one thing, but among Uber drivers, it's another. And amongst delivery drivers and so on, it's another. So really what you've got is you've got an employment structure where class consciousness is attached to a different labor process and with a good deal of precarity, whereas the auto worker was somebody who was an auto worker for life in many instances. That's not the case in Amazon and all the rest of it. Most people work there for a few years and then they get out, you know, I mean, if they possibly can. So what constitutes a working class is very, very different. But where I'm hopeful is to say, well, if you look at the employment structures around, instead of looking and saying, well, where is the factory? The factories have all gone, and the big factories, insofar as they're still there, are only employing maybe 2,000 or 3,000 people instead of 25,000 or 30,000 people. Where is their mass employment going on? And what kinds of things is it capable of doing? My hopeful idea about this is to say, well, what did you think about airports? Who runs an airport? You know, look at all the people there, the baggage handlers, and the other thing about the airport labor, look at the ethnic and gender structures that you find there. A lot of it is African American and immigrant, and a lot of it is women, you know, wage labor. If all the airport workers got a union, and they called themselves the JFK Union, and they suddenly decided to go on strike and stop the airports. I mean, this is this is a fantastic source of potential power. Now, at what point will all the workers at Kennedy get to the point of saying we want a union for the whole lot? You know, for the baggage handlers and you know, everybody else. But that would take a certain class consciousness even to begin to do that. So the question for me is, as I think you're asking, where does the class consciousness comes from to bring about the organization that can actually lead to class action? And there's a chicken and egg problem here. Class action depends upon class consciousness and vice versa. So there is a process at work there. And so one of the things that I think is interesting, and has been interesting in the last 6 months or so, is where has there been labor action? And yes, Starbucks and Amazon, two places where you wouldn't expect there to be union activism, but it's begun, and in some instances has before that, one of the things a couple of years ago, which was going on everywhere, were teachers' strikes. So, and again, in many instances, these were not unionized workers. They were just, you know, they were just people so pissed off that they were going out on strike. So the labor issue is starting to come back right now. And there are some very, very potential sites for organizing and for the possible construction of a political movement. But it's going to be very different from the sorts of things that the auto workers did. I mean, the union that Amazon will have is going to be very different from a conventional union. A union of Uber drivers is going to be really different, and delivery workers would be very different. Trying to have a union with a labor force that is precarious and is constantly moving. See, because one of the things you can't do if you're a worker in most instances is if you've got health care and benefits, you can't take them with you when you leave. You may actually lose all of that. So even pension rights, you find some people won't get a pension until they've worked 5 years. So capital employs them for 4 years, then fires them. You know, because these sorts of things happen. So we have some possibilities, but where they are and how they might work, I don't know. I mean, this the sort of thing where your ideas about this are probably as good as mine, if not better. Anyone else want to come in? I have to say, one of the things I really loved about this piece was the Chrysler building story. It's so astonishing. But this is what goes on in a rentier economy. You see, I mean, there's nothing to stop Cooper Union from just simply raising the rents like that. There's no law against it, and they're simply saying, well, you know, this is a very valuable piece of land. You know, I have a right to do it. And it is you know, in most instances, I don't know, I'm glad Cooper Union did it, because they may be able to go back to, you know, tuition-free education as a result. But you see, in that instance, it was a bit of a Robin Hood quality to it. But generally speaking, when it's Blackstone and all that, they're the ones who kind of are making the killing.
So with this talk of, you know, unionizing and striking, I was actually thinking about rent strikes. And I know that's not really a labor movement, but it does impact like all of these things that we're talking about in this section. I'm thinking about. Yeah.
Well, one of the things I've been anxious to do is when you go back and you look at the circulation of labor capacity, you remember that the experience of the laborer is in the labor market, in the labor process, out there as a money holder, going to get a commodity and all the rest of it. And the total life of a laborer is not just simply confined to the experience at the point of production. Now, the conventional Marxist way to look at this is just say that it's the experience at the point of production, which is crucial. But what happens right now is one of the things that goes on, and it comes out in these chapters, and the earlier one in particular, is that, for instance, the laborer is frequently also caught in a debt trap. So it's not only the labor process that's a problem, it's also the indebtedness that's a problem. And of course, they have to deal with high rents when they go into. So if you take the whole kind of process, I would argue that the experience of the laborer across all of those moments would mean that something like a rent strike is, for me, a part of what class struggle is about, because it's about the condition of life for the laborer in that circulatory kind of process. The thing about a rent strike is it's not only actually workers who are involved. Students may be involved, or you know, middle-class people or old-age pensioners may be involved. So all kinds of, so you get a different kind of a configuration of activists in the case of a rent strike. In terms of a rent control movement. But I've always felt that it was terribly important to recognize the whole life cycle and life experience of working people, and then ask what kinds of experiences do they have throughout, and what kinds of political activism is going to take over. And rent strikes are one of those points. Strikes against student debt and another one. I mean, in other words, this is, you know, we have to think about the totality of the circulation of labor capacity, so that we can understand. And this is where the class consciousness comes in, because if we insist that the only form of class consciousness that's valid is the experience of working, then we'll find that all the rest of it is kind of, you know, just peripheral. But what we need to do is to kind of say to working people, actually, you are up against capital at each one of these moments. In the labor process, you're up against capital. You're also up against capital as a money holder, because you're going to get credit card debt, and you're going to get all kinds of credit card fees and all that sort of thing. And you're also, you know, up against the capitalist who's monopolizing pharmaceutical drug prices. So In other words, I see all of those as part of the class condition. And that therefore we have to think about the whole class condition and not say, well, rent strikes is not about labor. I think it is about labor, but it's about labor plus. And that therefore I want to try and always keep them all together, because there's been a terrible history in the Marxist tradition of basically saying, the only thing that really matters is the experience in the workplace, and not only the workplace, but the experience in the factory. I mean, there's almost a kind of a fetishization of factory labor within the Marxist tradition, and the factory laborer is the one who has the class consciousness that's going to rescue us all. I don't believe that, and I think these days it's crazy to think in those terms. I think these days you kind of say, how are we up against capital, and what are the problems that capital poses for daily life in all of those areas, and in what ways can we mobilize in such a way that we can somehow or other do something about all of them. And that's what, but you could imagine that even in terms of a social democratic project. I mean, a social democratic project that said, all right, we're going to take care of affordable housing, we're going to take care of free education, and we're going to take care of free healthcare. That seems to me a class project, even though it's not specifically talking about the place of production.
Well, it's interesting too that I think the workplace and the home are very much overlapping right now as well. So it's maybe not a side of production in the traditional sense, but actually for many people it is a side of production, and that's true for people who've been able to stay at home during COVID, for us who are laboring right now in our class here online from our homes, but also for people who do like contract piecework in the digital market. So, I think you bring up an interesting point there with the rent strikes, because there is such an overlap now between home and work. Yeah.
Well, a lot of, to the degree that I have been an activist, I was heavily involved in a rent control campaign in Baltimore, and also in a living wage campaign in Baltimore. So I was heavily involved in those. And the rent control campaign, I was kept on insisting to many people, I saw this as a class issue. And not in the narrow sense that it's about kind of only about the workers, but that it's about the confrontation with landlord class and their ability to raise rents at will. And of course, in New York, the fact that there are so many people, there's about 1 million housing units in New York that are rent stabilized. If it wasn't for that, there'd be there are already 60,000 homeless people in New York City. If those 1 million units go out of being rent stabilized, and they are being pushed out step by step every year, they get fewer and fewer. But the fact that it was rent stabilized, and there are all these struggles over housing back in the sort of 1950s and 1960s, did something which is terribly important for the well-being of people. Now, it wasn't perfect, and in fact, there are lots of problems that are attached to the rent stabilization. I mean, I was in an apartment which was partially rent stabilized, and there was a woman who was living in a 1-bedroom apartment with 3 kids. And you say immediately, well, shouldn't you look for a slightly bigger place with that? And her response was, but this is rent stabilized. If I moved out of this rent stabilized place, I'll lose it all, and I'll have to pay something like 5 times the amount of rent that I'm paying. I mean, this is one of those places where if you were a regular renter, you were paying for a 2-bedroom apartment, you'd be paying $4,000 a month rent. And she was paying something like $900 a month rent. So this is again, this is the sort of, to me, this is a class issue. And that's why I want to call it a class issue rather than emphasize too much this notion of working class. It's a class issue, And in this class issue in which well-being of mass of the working population is very much affected by conditions of housing supply, and the fact that there are about 1 million apartments in New York which are rent stabilized, you know, is very significant. And I wouldn't say that people who struggled to bring that about were not fighting a class issue. I think they were. And I think they did so very effectively. And I think that the benefit of that is very considerable. Any other kind of comments anybody wants to make?
Yeah, it was just another layer to that came to mind as you were speaking was the gender and disability aspect of all of that. And just thinking of how, like, you know, like the domestic sphere is often gendered as like a women's sphere, and also the ways that folks with disabilities, you know, like issues of housing are often an issue that they face because of, you know, the way Social Security works and disability services work, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, there are just so many layers to how that incorporates groups that have been traditionally left out of like working class struggle.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, I think you know, again, very much about, you know, kind of saying, look, I think we have to try to find ways to incorporate as much as we can of these kinds of issues. And that's one of the issues I'm going to get to, not today, but in the last two sessions. Okay, so I'm going to go, it's around 7 o'clock, so I should, sorry, was it? Yeah, 7 o'clock. So I'm going to get into my reading session of the next, this is what I promised at the very beginning to try to do, was that at some point or other I was going to have to deal with the question of the state. And this is my attempt to take a crack at how to incorporate the state into a theory of the capitalist mode of production. And there are really a number of issues that I want to emphasize, and I'm going to do this very generally. And the first issue is to say that I'm very concerned to create a theory of the capitalist state. Now, there have been states and different states, but the capitalist state is a very special kind of state. So I'm interested in the capitalist state, not the state in general. And I think this is important because some of the literature sometimes treats the state outside of, as outside of the class nature of the society we live in. But so the capitalist state. So one of the first moves I make, however, is to say that I'm not going to talk about the state and capital. What I am going to do is I'm going to talk about that aspect of the state, which is deeply, deeply embedded in the accumulation of capital and the nature of capital and the circulation of capital. And that is the Treasury Department. So I'm going to disaggregate the state, you know, the education department and the, you know, all the other health department and so on, dealing with different things. But the Treasury Department of a state, which is the finance minister, or in Britain it's the Chancellor of the Exchequer, to begin with, it has a very special position in government. That is that it tends to be able to exercise veto power on other projects if they are not being paid for. And the Treasury is in effect that part of the state which is almost 100% glued to the idea of making capital work correctly. Now, this doesn't mean individual capitalists. It's about the class perspective. It's about the Treasury tries to use state power to make sure that capital gets reproduced in an orderly fashion and that it doesn't run into crises and it does all the right things. So the Treasury Department is what I'm going to talk about. And the Treasury Department is embedded in the state. It is that aspect of the state which is most clearly dedicated to the reproduction of capital and therefore the reproduction of capitalist class power. So that's if you like, is the second point I would want to make. The third point I would want to make is that the Treasury doesn't engage in all of this kind of thing on its own. In fact, there's a very important partnership which is set up between the Treasury, which is within the state, and the central bank, in the United States, the Federal Reserve. Now, the central bank is always the pinnacle of the private banking system. It is not within the state. So you have Treasury, which is within the state, dedicated to making the system work, and you have the central bank, which is outside of the state, also dedicated to trying to make the institutions of capital work. And it is the partnership between Treasury and the central bank, which I call the state finance nexus, which is really about, if you like, if you kind of said, who are the managers of this whole system? And who are the ones who kind of grab away to make sure that this system reproduces itself cleanly and reasonably and all the rest of it? And the answer is, it's this combination of Treasury within the state and the central bank outside of the state coming together and forming this state finance nexus. This is the third point I want to make. The fourth point I want to make is this, that it's erroneous to think that we can actually talk about the state in isolation from other states. In fact, one of the most important concepts which I get from the work of, say, somebody like Giovanni Arrighi is this idea of an interstate system. And that is, interstate relations are crucial, and the interstate system. So that the theory of the state has to be about its individual states in a system of a certain kind. And it's a bit like saying, well, you know, you can have a theory of the corporation, but the theory of capital is about the theory of all corporations. Well, the theory of the state is really going to have to be about the theory of the state in the context of an interstate system. And the qualities of the interstate system are terribly important. And the last point I want to make is this, that there is a process of transformation going on, which reflects in some ways the things we were doing this last week, which was about the rise of the Ranter and finance and so on. There seems to be some sort of transition going on in terms of governance structures, and that therefore the notion of a capitalist state is not something that is settled. It is something that is constantly in the process of transition, in the process, Marx uses this language, of becoming. It is ongoing and developing. And it has to be ongoing and developing in part because of those processes we talked about last time, which is, you know, this imbalance between the rate of creation of money and debt and the lag behind of the actual production of goods and services. Well, how does the state respond to this? Well, they can't do it maybe with the institutions they've got right now, so they have to go out and invent new institutions. And so you'll see new institutions being set up. Historically, things like the International Monetary Fund, which came on board in the 1945-50 period, you have something like that, which is new institutions being created to handle new circumstances. And I think we're running into new circumstances, so the state is a project. It's an ongoing project. It's not finished. And I don't see it being finished next year either. It's, in other words, it's not the kind of thing of, well, okay, in 2 years' time, it's going to be finished. It's an ongoing project, and there's been continuous processes of transformation in the capitalist state since the beginnings of capital. And that therefore, it is a dynamic kind of concept of the state that we're going to look at. So those are the issues I'm going to. So watch for these issues in what follows. So here's the lecture, and I begin again, this is part of a methodological precept. I begin by talking about a particular set of incidents. These are the surface appearances that Marx liked to talk about, which we then kind of interrogate to try to figure out the underlying conceptual apparatus that explains what's going on, and then we use that to try to redevelop our interpretations of how the capitalist mode of production is working. So here's where I go. And I start with this, that on October 19th, 1987, a day known as Black Monday in the annals of financial history, the Dow Jones Industrial Average dropped by 22.6% in one day, the biggest drop ever in its illustrious history. As many commentators noted, this event occurred less than a year after the Big Bang unification of the world's major stock markets. The violence of the collapse in the United States instantaneously hit the whole world of capital. Now, the context of all of this was a grumbling debt crisis in emerging markets throughout the world that began with the Mexican debt crisis in 1982. The surpluses acquired by the Gulf states from oil revenues in the 1970s were recycled into the global economy via the New York investment banks as development loans at easy rates to needy states. The great thing about lending to needy states, famously quipped Citibank's Walter Wriston, was that you always knew where to find them if they reneged on their payments. But when interest rates suddenly rose in 1979 to 80, many countries found themselves caught in a debt trap that elicited structural adjustment programs administered by the IMF, backed by the US Treasury. The austerity package imposed upon Mexico and others meant a serious drop in standards of living and loss of labor and other domestic rights. All this to make sure that the investment banks got back most of their money. Domestically in the United States, irresponsible speculative activities in the savings and loan sector was also a source of severe distress for depositors, as well as for those who had invested through the S&Ls in uneconomic building projects. But to this day, there is no settled explanation of the violence of the Black Monday event. In the search to find answers, the US brought together the major players in the US Treasury and the Federal Reserve, along with almost every big-name economist in the United States and beyond. The conference papers were a mix of technically incomprehensible and ideologically driven. The one that stood out for me, however, was that of Larry Summers. He focused, as did many others, on the problem of moral hazard. It had been clear since the New York fiscal crisis of the mid-1970s that in the event of the financial system going belly up because of irresponsible speculative investments, state power would be deployed to rescue the banks and not bother about helping the people affected. The result was irresponsible, high-risk and speculative investment strategies. This plainly had something to do with the events of Black Monday and the S&L domestic crisis. What Summers seemed to suggest was that there was a policy choice between tighter regulation of finance, with at best low growth or even stagnation, and the embrace of moral hazard through financial deregulations that would generate far higher growth rates, punctuated almost certainly by periodic crises. If the latter course were chosen, then preparations should be made to handle such crises and mitigate their violence. It was also clear, he said, that the US could not do this alone. The unification of global stock and financial markets would involve international planning and agreements. After 1987, and particularly in the Clinton years, the moral hazard option prevailed. A detailed assessment by the JP Morgan research arm towards the end of the 1990s suggested that most of the rather tepid growth in comparison with the 1960s over the previous 2 decades was due to moral hazard. In 1999, with Larry Summers as Treasury Secretary, the Glass-Steagall Act, the last regulatory barrier that had kept retail and investment banking at arm's length since the 1930s, the Glass-Steagall Act was repealed, thus permitting unwieldy conglomerates like Citigroup to form while promoting speculation. This came at the end of a decade in which Wall Street effectively dictated economic and social policy to the Clinton administration. Even before taking office, Clinton was advised by Robert Rubin, originally from Goldman Sachs, but now nominated as his Treasury Secretary, that his re-election prospects depended on cultivating the Wall Street connection. Clinton campaigned on universal health care and social investments. What he delivered was punitive neoliberal reforms of welfare and criminal justice, NAFTA, the reckless expansion of mortgage finance to foster economic growth, culminating in the abolition of Glass-Steagall. Few would now deny that all of this had something to do with the catastrophic collapse of 2007 and 8. There is a dispute as to how much. The immediate response to Black Monday was to flood the market with liquidity. This seemed to work and has been widely deployed since, when combined with some technical reforms of the stock market, such as the introduction of circuit breakers to trading in order to stop the lemming instinct of investors to all jump off the investment cliff at the same time. But Summers was right to suggest the embrace of moral hazard would produce crisis tendencies. The Wild West of the investment world, known as the dot-com bubble of the 1990s, ended badly in the stock market crash of 2001, leaving a few startups, like Amazon, to later surge to the fore. But the coming instability was signaled by the collapse of Enron and, even more significantly, long-term capital management, a hedge fund run by two Nobel laureates in economics, who speculated on Russian and Southeast Asian debt, only to be caught big time in their collapses in 1998. Long-term was bailed out, and this is significant, at the behest of the New York Federal Reserve. But it was bailed out by a consortium of 14 banks who were brought together by the Federal Reserve. I'd like to have seen that meeting, who put up $3.4 billion to liquidate long-term's untenable positions. Furthermore, the rolling debt crisis passing from Thailand to South Korea and lots of countries in between, except in China, was causing sufficient mayhem as to raise the threat of contagion throughout the global economy. South Korea became a trigger point. Bankruptcy seemed imminent. It took some illicit combination of the International Monetary Fund and the US Treasury, which is not supposed to interfere in IMF affairs, to quell the threat. But as I earlier saw, the East Asian debt crisis left behind a set of seriously mauled and maimed economies, and a lot of much healthier and wealthier foreign bankers and investors. The rolling crisis then spread to Russia and Argentina in 2001. Yet in each case, it ended up being geographically contained. The stock exchange correction in the USA in 2001 was largely an internal affair. It was parlayed by Alan Greenspan, then chair of the Federal Reserve and a great fan of Ayn Rand's libertarian neoliberalism, into a passing event by lowering interest rates and bolstering liquidity. This shifted the emphasis of investment flows from the speculative US stock market, largely fixed capital, to the speculative US housing and property market, i.e. the consumption fund. And it was this that culminated in the housing foreclosure crisis and financial debacle of 2007 to 8. When the latter crisis hit, it caught almost everyone in or close to power by surprise. When Her Majesty the Queen asked the economists of the British Academy why they had not seen the troubles coming, they confessed they had no idea and went back and wrote a collective report in which they claimed that a lot of good, hardworking and dedicated economists had somehow missed something called systemic risk. Pretty astonishing admission. The key moment came on September 25th, 2008, when Lehman was let go and forced into bankruptcy. The combined work of the US Treasury, Hank Paulson from Goldman Sachs, and the Federal Reserve Chair, Ben Bernanke, had tried to find a buyer for Lehman, but had lucked out. And when they tried to work out the value of Lehman's assets, they did such a poor job of valuing foreclosed housing assets as to make Lehman seem much more vulnerable than it was. It also transpired that by letting Lehman go, they globalized what had up until then largely been a US-based crisis. Whether this was deliberate or not is hard to tell. The self-serving books of Geithner, then Federal Reserve chief in the New York office, and Paulson are of little help in explaining what happened. But with the failure to find a buyer, the obvious option was to temporarily nationalize the banks, as Sweden did when faced with an analogous problem in the early 1990s. Paulson, however, had no wish to go down in history as the first person ever to dare nationalize the US banks, even temporarily. Had he done so, every Republican in Congress would endlessly have reviled him. Obama, we should note, briefly nationalized General Motors in the crisis that followed, eliciting plenty of caustic criticism from Republicans. But in the case of the banks, Bernanke and Paulson went back to the tried and true neoliberal principle of saving the banks at the expense of the American people. This was done directly by flooding the banks, whether troubled or not, with a huge mass of liquidity in the fanciful belief that it would all trickle down to the needy masses. The Troubled Asset Relief Program, TARP, that emerged after plenty of bickering with Congress, had begun with a 3-page memo jointly authored by Paulson and Bernanke. These two took charge, with President Bush nowhere to be seen, and the members of Congress taken up with trying to stuff square facts into round ideological holes. Congress converted a 3-page memo into 300 pages or so of legislative text. The core principle was to give the 6 major banks in the country massive amounts of money and ask them to spend it and get the economy humming again. But the US banks, unlike those in China, are private institutions that do as they please. And what pleased them was to take the money, retire some of their debts, and to buy back their own stocks. This increased the bank's stock market value, which triggered larger bonuses for management. The recovery from the recession therefore took place very slowly, helped by 2 significant features. Firstly, President Bush convened a meeting of the G20, which initially agreed to mount a coordinated global rescue package. This coordination fell apart a few months later, as each state took its own path, rejecting US leadership. Secondly, and far more important, China responded to the collapse of its export market in the United States with a massive internal expansion of investments in urbanism and in the built environment, capital of an independent kind, plus the consumption fund. This expanded global demand for raw materials, agricultural commodities, and semi-finished products. Supplying countries, like Australia and Chile, quickly recovered from the effects of the crisis. China rescued global capitalism from falling into a long-term 1930s type depression. It plainly did not do so because of any loyalty to capital. It needed to keep domestic employment opportunities open and thriving in the face of widespread job losses in order to ensure its own political stability. Its success in so doing was what saved global capital from itself. So, if this is the surface appearance of events, what theoretical insights can we generate when we dig deeper into the underlying forces at work as to the position and role of the state in relation to the inner structures of a capitalist mode of production? The US Treasury was and is intimately involved in all of capital's activities. But this is only one key department in the state apparatus. The state has to be conceptualized, therefore, as an assemblage of very different departments and circulatory systems constituting a somewhat amorphous totality with multiple links into the capitalist mode of production. The Treasury Department administers fiscal policies. It deals with tax collection and distribution, debt creation and public investments, while often assuming veto power by the state budget over other departments' proposals, judged too costly. The Treasury Department, in short, lords it over the circulation of tax revenues and national debt within the totality of capital. It is consequently the least sensitive department to the needs of the people and the most carefully attentive department within the state apparatus when it comes to the needs and requirements of capital. The Treasury Department is captive to capitalist class needs, especially when the needs of the class go against the interests of many individual capitalists or even sections of capital. whereas other departments may on occasion be run by democratic leftists or even radicals. Furthermore, as Marx noted, national debts, and I'm quoting him, i.e. the alienation of the state, whether despotic, constitutional, or republican, marked with its stamp the capitalist era. As with the stroke of an enchanter's wand, the public debt endows barren money with the power of breeding and thus turns it into capital, without the necessity of exposing itself to the troubles and risks inseparable from the employment in industry or even usury. The circulation of tax revenue expands as it circulates, and the state looks to some version of cost-benefit analysis to calculate the benefits of its investments for capital. Marx here attributes capital formation, particularly long-term capital investments in physical infrastructures and the built environment, to state action. There are other avenues for capital accumulation than that charted by industrial capital. The capitalist state, via its Treasury Department, internalizes strong relations to finance capital and a debt credit system. It also claims certain regulatory rights over the circulation of capital in general, while promoting investments in the built environment, both productive and non-productive, which, as the China case clearly shows, can be mobilized as an antidote to the crisis tendencies. But the Treasury Department does not act alone. The central bank, the Federal Reserve, is also involved. The central bank under capital is generally construed to be the pinnacle of the private banking system, and it therefore ought to be independent and autonomous from the state apparatus. Yet when crises break out, it regularly appears as an equal partner with the Treasury Department in seeking solutions. Like the Treasury Department, the central bank should operate purely in the class interest of capital, though, as Marx complains, the bankers who run it frequently do so in their own personal or factional interest. Hence, there was no surprise that it was Hank Paulson from Treasury and Ben Bernanke from the Fed who authored and publicly promoted the proposals for exiting the 2007-8 crisis in a way that was adequate for the needs of capital. From time to time, the central bank is brought inside the state apparatus, but rarely with happy results. The situation in Turkey right now in 2022, in which President Erdogan imposed on the central bank the idea that high interest rates hurt the economy, is illustrative. There have been several chairs of the central bank in Turkey. Erdogan has fired them and he's now put his nephew in charge. It is generally held, though not by Erdogan, that the independence of the central bank should be sacrosanct. It was the Labour Chancellor of the Exchequer, Gordon Brown, who engineered a rechartering the Bank of England a few years ago to ensure its independence. But from its very inception, the separation and insulation of the central bank from state power was crucial. When the British monarchy, bankrupted by costly wars, sought loans from the wealthy London merchants in the 1690s, the latter refused. Instead, it was agreed in 1694 to charter a bank controlled by the merchants, but dedicated to providing loans to the state and with powers of issuing fiat monies against the money commodities, gold and silver in its vaults. Members of the monarchy could become stockholders without exercising a controlling interest. This poses an interesting problem. What do revolutionary governments from the left do about the central bank? This poses a serious conundrum. In the Paris Commune of 1871, the communards protected the Bank of France, a fact that earned Lenin's intense criticism, but the Soviets did not do much better. The Moralist revolutionary regime in Bolivia pursued sound fiscal policies and protected their central bank, which earned them praise from the International Monetary Fund that circumscribed their capacity to re-engineer their economy along socialist lines. The problem here is that the monetary system that is required for market exchange cannot easily be abolished, and the management of money is entirely within the purview of the state, i.e. the Treasury plus the central bank. So how then do we depict the positionality of the central bank vis-a-vis the Treasury Department? Arrangements in the United States provide illustrative materials. The central bank is a key institution in civil society. Its main role is to manage the real rate of interest, nominal rate minus inflation. It is based within the capitalist social formation. This parallels the Treasury Department's positionality within the state apparatus, where it is charged with determining the viability of congressionally mandated fiscal and taxation policies. This is a tacit acknowledgement at a rather high level of abstraction that the adequate management of the circulation of capital has to rest on some sort of public-private partnership of the sort that is often appealed to in the designs of very large-scale projects. This sort of duality, it turns out, lies at the heart of bourgeois forms of governance more generally. The Justice Department is within the state, but is relationally partnered in civil society by all the judges and lawyers in a judicial system having its pinnacle in the Supreme Court. The Justice Department, Supreme Court, Treasury, Central Bank. The military apparatus is within the federal state, but all the local police and militia forces are outside. The Commerce Department is partnered by the Association of Business Manufacturers and Chambers of Commerce, the Labor Department by the trade unions, the Health Department by the CDC, and so on. Plainly, the balance of power within and without the state can shift substantially with class politics and the politicization of institutions, such as the Supreme Court and the Federal Reserve of the United States, or the Central Bank in Turkey. The Central Bank in Turkey's policies have resulted in a collapse of the lira and a huge increase in inflation. This can have major effects upon how governance is working, thus determining the direction civil society moves in. Now, there are some theories of the state which seek to internalize these dualities. One of Gramsci's key contributions, and I quote Chantal Mouffe on this, is his conception of the integral state. And what I'm looking at here is the integral state in a way, which he conceived as including both political society and civil society. This should not be understood as a statization of civil society, says Mouffe, but an indication of the profoundly political character of civil society, presented as the terrain of the struggle for hegemony between the classes. To the degree that all of these relations are suffused with or tainted by what Althusser called the state ideological apparatus, then the question of politics moves to the forefront of theorizing. Which political faction controls which institution, with which ruling ideas, is the question. It is not at all uncommon for the two sides of the state, Treasury, and civil society, the Federal Reserve, to be as much in opposition as in concordance with each other. In a crisis, however, it is critical that both sides come together. When they do, they form what I shall call a state-finance nexus. This was what the joint appearance of Paulson and Bernanke signaled, and the three-page policy proposal, which eventually underpinned TARP, was the tangible policy response. The state-finance nexus, then, is the organizational form that crystallizes out as the finance and credit system comes to assume its guiding role as the central nervous system regulating capital flow down various channels. Channels like commodity and surplus value production, consumption capacity, land development, asset values, price formation, and most importantly of all, control over inflation. These are all within the remit of the central bank. In fact, the last of these is a key mandate for the European Central Bank. Elsewhere, this mandate on inflation is usually combined with policy objectives on full employment, balance of payments positions, and the like. The state finance nexus is from the beginning to end an organizational form built to ensure what is adequate to capital in general as a class formation. And that is emphatically that. The state finance nexus constructs, however, some kind of bridge between aspects of state and capital within the capitalist mode of production on the one hand, and the theory of capitalism as a social formation on the other. The inner structure of a capitalist mode of production contains, as it were, a restricted opening via the state finance nexus into the rich complexity of economic forces at work within the social formation. The theory of capital, therefore, has one foot in the state theory, another in that of the capitalist social formation. In the crisis of 2007-2008, collaboration between Treasury and the Federal Reserve was critical in seeking an exit from the crisis. The distinction between the Treasury and the Federal Reserve broadly reflects that between fiscal and monetary policy as regulatory levers applied to facilitate capital accumulation. Even more importantly, it reveals a structure in which the capitalist state and some aspect of civil society, as represented by the banking system, are ineluctably wedded to each other, though by no means always in a happy marriage. There have been serious, but in the long run, unsuccessful attempts to divorce them or merge one of them into the other. But these arrangements are still in the process of becoming. Capitalist state formation is, in this sense, ongoing. What is being proposed here is a theory of state action that is partially internalized within the laws of motion of capital. This gives Giovanni Arrighi's concept of the historical fusion of state and capital some modern purchase. The really important transition, Arrighi asserts, is not that from feudalism to capitalism, but from scattered to concentrated capitalist power. And the most important aspect of this much neglected transition is the unique fusion of state and capital, which was realized nowhere more favorably for capitalism than in Europe. Capitalism, Braudel had earlier commented, only triumphs when it becomes identified with the state, when it is the state. A somewhat enigmatic entry in Marx's Grundrisse refers to concentration of bourgeois society in the form of the state, viewed in relation to itself. And a later entry reads, the concentration of the whole in the state, followed by international relation. State development and the increasing centralization of capital appear to go hand in hand, while the enigmatic and unexplored international relation needs both practical and theoretical elucidation. Now, this is a dangerous position to take, given that attempts to create a Marxist theory of the state in the 1970s became so extremely contentious. At that time, there was, firstly, little attempt to theorize what was distinctive about the capitalist state. Secondly, it was assumed that the state was outside of and somehow independent and autonomous of capital, though occasionally called upon to intervene when things went wrong. And thirdly, there was a reluctance to accept that the distinctively capitalist state was, and still is, a work in progress. While the capitalist state may be independent and autonomous, it is nevertheless subsumed within the overall logic and laws of motion of capital. Somewhere or other my television is turned on, so excuse me. Sorry about that. Somebody flicked a switch somewhere and things went all very wobbly. Okay. Now, I was talking about this as a dangerous position to state, and there was very little attempt to try to theorize the state in the way that I'm dealing with it here. While the capitalist state may be independent and autonomous, it is nevertheless, I argue, subsumed within the overall logic and laws of motion of capital, or at least a part of the capitalist state is. The latter are, in turn, very much affected by the processes of capitalist state formation. How then does this subsumption work? In exploring the value transfers that arise through the equalization of the rate of profit, the existence of certain entities was presumed, from juridical individuals to firms, corporations, administrative institutions, whole economic sectors, or sovereign states. These are the entities that can create, receive, store, or disperse the value transferred. There is nothing natural about these entities. They are all historical and social constructs, put in place and acknowledged as thing-like entities, supported and perpetuated by customary social practices, ultimately acquiring a certain legal status in administrative law. Once formed, such entities, such as sovereign states, can become substantial, long-lived, and hard to change. They then appear as unshakable material social facts that function as active agents in the field of political economic practices. This is particularly the case with capitalist states. Economic relations between the different entities were and still are mediated in part by way of market exchanges between them, occurring within a distinctive legal order and a system of global governance. In the long 20th century, Giovanni Arrighi draws upon Fernand Braudel to argue that the rise of capital was in part initiated by the rise of a distinctively capitalist state embedded within and shaped by an interstate system. This interstate system was uniquely European. Interstate competition within Europe opened pathways for the further development of intercapitalist competition. The possibility of the becoming of the state was typically ruled out in the hierarchical political forms characteristic of the Ottoman and Mughal empires and the Chinese dynasties. In Europe, the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648 ended the 30 Years' War, opened the path for a capitalist state formation, producing a recognizable and reasonably stable, even if warlike, interstate system within which capital and the capitalist state could not only fairly freely operate and develop, but also merge with and become an active agent within assemblages of state power. The Westphalia Treaty sought to recognize and guarantee the sovereignty of each state and respect for state boundaries across Western Europe. This was a critical first step towards the organization of a European-wide interstate system within which capital could deepen and flourish. Deprived in principle, though not all alas in practice, of the right and ability to raid, loot, or conquer the lands around them, and to thereby violently acquire gold, wealth, and even forced labor, the newly minted post-Westphalian states had to cultivate their own capacities for wealth creation based within their own borders, even when engaging in places like Amsterdam and London in external trade. Here, Adam Smith's advice to statesmen to let price-fixing markets do their work within the state and to unleash entrepreneurial endeavors to maximize surplus production became important and ultimately determinant. Economic competition within the European interstate system over everything from military power, technological mix, knowledge production, ways of life, and strategies of production became the norm. What might be termed the coercive laws of interstate competition, particularly for technological and military superiority, put states in a position of being active agents and rivals in the pursuit of technological superiority and the pursuit of greater and greater wealth. The intensity of this military rivalry ultimately produced two world wars, of course, within the European interstate system. The institutions of collaboration and cooperation that were put into place after 1945 across the European space, with the support of the United States, were consciously designed to minimize the probability of such warlike outcomes. The re-engineering of the European interstate system and the creation of the European Union was successful in that regard. When wars came, as they did in Bosnia and the Ukraine, they were on the periphery of the European interstate system and not at its center. Interstate economic competition, on the other hand, seems to have intensified. With the formation of the European Union, the member states were open to free flows of both capital and labor. With the dismantling of the capital controls that had restricted capital mobility in the Bretton Woods era, the whole world became much more open to capital flow after the 1970s. States found themselves forced to compete to attract highly mobile money capital, which meant the state emphasizing deregulation, privatization, labor flexibility, anti-union politics, and where necessary, subsidies to corporate capital to settle here rather than there. In the neoliberal era, the coercive laws of interstate economic competition were given free rein. In one of those ironies that only capital can produce, Michael Bloomberg, then mayor of New York City, was leading a vociferous campaign in 2006-07 to totally deregulate financial services in the United States because the light touch regulation in the United Kingdom was conferring an unfair advantage to London when it came to the location of firms offering such services that were, at that time, on the brink of going bust. In spite of this, there is no question but that the bondholders and the financiers after 1980 or so were in a position to dictate to state powers the terms of their investments. In the European case, countries like Greece and Italy were in effect governed by the bondholders' appointees when they ran into financial difficulties. Colonial explorations and imperialist practices stretching way, way back on the part of individual states, largely led by the merchants, but also by the development of imperialist powers and politics, such as Britain, France, and Holland, sought to superimpose a version of the interstate system over the whole world, which is far from being inactive in response. For example, the Meiji Restoration in Japan in 1848 opened the way to forms of capitalist development in Japan. While it partially responded to the interventions of Western colonial power, it also rested on the specific conditions prevailing under the Tokugawa dynasty that preceded the Meiji Revolution, monetization and market-based commodity production in particular. The Japanese, of course, later built their own imperial and warlike expansionist state. In the wake of World War II, attempts were made to build a network of multi-layered institutions such as the International Monetary Fund, Bank of International Settlements, the World Bank, and numerous spin-offs from the United Nations in the hope that they could curb or contain the formation of interstate alliances and power blocks and the struggle for influence and hegemony on the world stage. These are the kinds of issues that Marx's casual invocation of international relations raise. They need far more detailed scrutiny and analysis than can be accomplished here. Placing state formation and the creation of the interstate system in the forefront, as opposed to a dangling afterthought in political economy, is a controversial move. Marx, for example, did not set out any guidance as to how the role of the state might best be specified. In the first volume of Capital, he merely assumes a market in which juridical individuals endowed with private property rights freely exchange with each other without any mention of the state as guarantor of such legal rights and contracts. The state does appear in Marx's money chapter as a regulatory agent and guarantor of local currencies, coinage and fiat money. And in later chapters, the state takes on regulatory roles with respect to the working day, the Factory Acts, Education Acts, and so on. The state's interventions in historical processes of primitive accumulation were, in Marx's all too brief account, critical to the transition from feudalism to capitalism. So I conclude that the capitalist state can never be an institution or set of institutions interacting with capital only in times of distress. Interstate competition, and I quote Giovanni Arrighi again, has been a critical component of each and every phase of financial expansion and a major factor in the formation of those blocks of governmental and business organizations that have led the capitalist world economy through its successive phases of material expansion. The relation of state formation to the finance form of capital is critical in this accounting. But this is also suggests that the capitalist state and interstate system is an unfinished and evolving project within the historical geography of capital. The dynamic history of capital in its spiral form both affects and is affected by evolutions in the capitalist state, or those parts of the capitalist state that are deeply relevant, and its forms. Arrighi's idea of a fusion between state and capitalist, perhaps premature, though not, as we shall see, impossible. The state is, of course, at base a territorial form of social organization. I then discuss some preceding territorial social forms. One I find most interesting is the way in which Catholicism organized the whole of the European space in bishoprics and parishes and all the rest of it. So it was a way of organizing space for administrative purposes, and I think capitalists followed, international capitalists followed very much in that kind of model. So then I'll take up the struggle for territorial integrity and the fighting of wars between clans, royal houses, religious factions, and cultural formations from the Crusades onwards permeated the European space. Military organization, the competition for technologies of war arose out of warring entities in competition with each other. The imperial regimes of China, Mughal administration, could not do this. Even in Europe, Arrighi notes, the processes of state formation more often than not ended up in failure. Germany and Italy, for example, were only unified in the late 19th century, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire did not break up until the early 20th, leaving the contrasting state forms of Britain and France as the paradigmatic early examples of bourgeois state power, in contrast to Spain and Portugal, that could not slough off their feudal and Catholic heritage. The only outlier within this history of capitalist state formation is, of course, Japan, by way of the Meiji Restoration. But to wage war, states or principalities need to cultivate an adequate and loyal population, often emphasizing cultural, linguistic, or religious solidarities and loyalties. In recognition of this, the modifier nation is often added to the concept of the state, even though in practice, many states are plurinational: the United Kingdom, Belgium, Finland, Switzerland, Canada, Ecuador, Bolivia, India, China, and of course the United States are all plurinational states. In addition, states had to amass enough wealth to hire, pay, and equip mercenary armies over and above the payment through looting rights the conquest depended upon. This all required a thriving economy and an ability to repay state debts. The well-being of the nation state became attached to a certain model of economic development. Over time, this model became increasingly dependent upon the activities of resident merchants and financiers. It is in this context that the political economic theory of mercantilism, the capturing of wealth by the state through trade, arose in the 17th and 18th century. Merchants required, or at least preferred, certain conditions to conduct their activities. First, they needed, from the military and policing apparatus, some measure of protection for trading activities that were vulnerable to robbery, violent expropriation, or the imposition of penurious taxes, tribute, or tithes by political groups or persons hungry for revenues or wealth. The question of security and protection for trade remains of signal importance to this day. The World Trade Organization, the WTO, rules established in 1995 make the expropriation or nationalization of economic sectors extremely onerous. Secondly, merchants need the recognition and protection by the legal system of ownership rights to private property by juridically recognized individuals. Thirdly, they needed stability and integrity for the money form, at the first level for gold and silver, and later for metallic coinage and fiat paper monies. This helped standardize exchange values. Finally, mechanisms had to exist within the financial system or the state to enforce contracts and timely repayment of debts. None of these conditions were instantaneously granted or achieved, but as Janet Abou-Lagarde shows, they were sufficiently well established to allow for an astonishing array of merchant activities, often under very difficult conditions and over extraordinary distances, as early as the 14th century across the whole of the European and Asiatic space. While states of many sorts could be and were constructed, the formative years of the capitalist state were marked not by a fusion, but by an intense ongoing negotiation within Europe between states as crucibles of power and war-making machines on one hand, and the needs of merchant capitalists operating within a networked market system on the other. Marx, in his writings on primitive accumulation, plainly recognized the importance of much of this. He outlined the historical importance of national state debts and the evolutionary history of world capitalism. With the national debt arose an international credit system, which often conceals one of the sources of primitive accumulation of this or that people. Thus, the villainies of the Venetian thieving system formed one of the secret bases of the wealth of Holland, to whom Venice in her decline lent large sums of money. So was it with Holland and England. By the beginning of the 18th century, Holland has ceased to be the nation preponderant in commerce and industry. One of the main lines of business, therefore, became the lending out of enormous amounts of capital, especially to its great rival England. The same thing is going on today between England and the United States, and all of that is what Arrighi points out. No, sorry, this is all Marx pointing out, and here in astonishingly succinct outline is the whole thesis of Arrighi's book on the long 20th century. It deals not only with state formation, but the role of finance in bringing about geographical shifts in hegemonic power within the interstate system. This began with the Italian city-states, Venice and Genoa in particular, followed by Amsterdam and the Low Countries, before jumping scale to that of Britain in the late 18th century. It then shifted at the very end of the 19th century to the United States, leaving us with an intriguing question as to where it might be headed now, when we are plainly in yet another phase of radical financialization. In Broadell's view, financialization typically signals the autumn of a given hegemonic formation rather than its apogee. So there are plenty of signs that we are at the end of the American domination. This capsule history proposes a very distinctive answer to the question, what is capital? While the idea of identity or fusion of state and capital might appear too radical, the conception of capital accumulation without state interventions and supports is not viable either. The state-finance nexus is an integral feature of the capitalist state, and is here and only here where the fusion of state and capital occurs. But this is a work in progress. What is notable about these arrangements is the conjoining of public and private forces. Political struggles over control of the bourgeois state and its design, e.g. its constitution, and governance are omnipresent, of course. Although the bourgeois state is often assumed to be strong, if not sacrosanct, it often turns out to be a rather fragile construct, as recent events in the United States, as well as many other parts of the world, have shown. Throughout this turbulent history, the bourgeois state has in any case undergone periodic reconstructions to accommodate, for example, the rising mass of product and of value that a capitalist mode of production inevitably produces. While the internal forms of administration and organization have been periodically revolutionized by the wide-ranging technological and organizational changes, such as digital monitoring that have permeated capitalist society in general. With these technological possibilities and with the tenseness of the situation, I think it is to anticipate it that there is likely to be a really radical reconfiguration of state powers and state configurations in the near future. Okay. Well, I've taken us away to comment. Anybody want to, any immediate questions you want to pose? So I'll put this on the web so you can read it at your leisure and come up with commentaries. And we'll meet in person in 2 weeks' time. I'm looking forward to that. Be fun. Get to see one another in reality. Any other questions? Any? Okay, sorry that's a bit long, but this was a very complicated thing to write, and some of it's a bit redundant, so sorry about that. Sorry about the interruption too. Don't know how that happened. But anyway, okay. So, ciao.
Thank you, Professor.